Okay, so in this video, I'm going to continue off of what I was saying earlier. So if you recall, I had put something like this in my print statement before. Now, I'm still not going to explain exactly what end equals an empty string does, but I'll explain kind of what I did here. So there is something there's a way where you can have optional arguments or optional parameters. And essentially, when you want to have an optional parameters, you have to give it a default value. So I can give it a default value of like 0 if I want. I could give it a default value of 5 if I want. I can give it anything. In fact, it doesn't even need to be a number. It could be, you know, a boolean, or it could be a string. It could be literally whatever you want, of course. But for this example, I'm going to use 0. Now, I made this function called a cool function, and essentially what it does is it adds the first and the second arguments together and multiplies the second and the third arguments. Now, by default, what do you think it'll do in here? Since by default I've set the second argument to equal 0, it will multiply 0 by whatever I put for argument 3, and it will do 0 plus argument 1. So that means it's just going to give me back what I put for argument 1. Now, that's what this part of the function does. What do you think the return thing does? Now, rather than what I had done earlier, where I printed something and I actually did some action inside of my code, there's also, like, generally when you use a function, right, you might not want to just do an action, but you might want to return some information. You might want to process some information. So if I gave it 3 arguments, I want to process what exactly will happen when I run this set of operations to these arguments. And what it'll do is it'll return whatever the output of of those operations is. So when I run a cool function, right, I have to actually add, or in fact, I could set a new variable and set it equal to whatever the outcome of this is. So if I did this, right, and let's say I want to give a value to argument 2. What did I do here? Oh, right, my bad. Let's go. Okay. And because I didn't put any print statements, it didn't print anything out for me. But now when I print y out, there you go, we have 9. So I changed it up a little bit over here. I made the default argument as the last one, just for the sake of clarity. I'll just change these names real quick. So now what it does is it multiplies the second argument by the third one, which is by default 0. Now, if I put all 3 arguments that I need, then it won't set argument 3 as 0, but it'll actually give whatever value I put for argument 3. But if I didn't put anything for argument 3, it'll just pretend argument 3 is 0, and it'll still run this. So that's a nice thing. You can have like optional arguments. Now, of course, you can also have more than one optional argument, but let's say I only want to give this argument a value. I don't want to give this argument a value, but only this one. How do you think I would do that? I can't, like, you'll see when I try to put that in a function, right? Ultimately, it reads everything by the order of which I put the arguments. So my first argument will be set to argument 1. My second will be set to argument 2. My third will be set to argument 3. So even if I put 4 over here, it will still set argument 3 to be the number 4. So instead, what do you think I have to do? Well, I literally have to type out argument 4 equals 4. And that's how I'm saying that I want to um, change only the argument for argument 4. Change only the number for argument 4. So in this case, what I did was it changed the fourth argument to being um, 4, right? But since we do 0 divided by um, actually, I'm not quite sure what's happening here. I do argument 2 times argument 3, that gives me 0. Then I do 0 divided by argument 1. So 0 divided by 4 is 0. And then you do 0 plus argument 1, which is 1, which is why you get 1 as your answer. So as you see, argument 3 remained unchanged. Only argument 4 changed. Now, instead, I could also just do argument 3 And since it's already in the right spot for the third argument, I don't need to write argument 3. If I wanted, I could, but I don't need to. And there's a few other rules about how you put your argument names. Generally, when you're using the vex functions, it's a good habit to know what the names of the arguments are. And I'll show you a website where you can find all the documentation for those functions so you'll know what the names of each argument is. So generally, when you're writing code with the vex functions, you should put the name of the argument and then equals to the number, because there are a lot of arguments that it gives you, and a lot of those you might want to just leave as their default values. So yeah, but that's what I did here, right? There was an argument for end, and there were probably a lot of other arguments that exist as well if I want to change. But by default, I want to keep my end to equaling something. But in this case, I want to change end to be an empty string instead. So that's what I did here, essentially. That's what the equals does. And as I said earlier, return just gives me back the value. It doesn't perform an action, but rather it just gives me back the processed information of whatever I want. So of course, if I want, I can have an action happen in here as well. I could do something like x equals 4, x equals 3, and I also want to return x, and I want to print x. I want to do all three, right? Let's say I want to do all three. I can do all three if I want as well. So yeah, there's a lot of options when it comes to it. But generally, for vex, I think a lot of the times you might not need to use return unless you have something oriented around like an optical sensor or something, or even an AI sensor, which would need to process your data. And that would be something which gives you a return. Like, for example, it would return whether an object is detected based off certain criteria it checks for in your function. So that's where you might use a return versus somewhere where you don't need to use a return and you could just give it a straight up print statement. At the same time, if I try to um, print something that doesn't have a return value, right? If I don't actually end up giving back any information and I just perform this action, when I try to print the returned value, it will give me this thing called none, because there is no returned value. It's the returned value is none. So yeah. If you give it a return value, of course, it will still return whatever you want, as I actually already demonstrated down here. I still return x, but I also print x. I can do both if I want, or I could just do one or the other. So yeah, that's what it is about these optional arguments and returns. Yeah, returning stuff.